This is the part where most men would scream or beg or shatter. This is also the part where $5 million quietly changed everything. And this is the part my wife still thinks she understands even now. 2 months after my wife walked out with excuses that smelled like borrowed courage and bad timing, I inherited $5 million from an uncle nobody in the family liked to talk about. And 2 days after that, she came back to my door smiling like fate had tripped her and pushed her home. I did not cry when she left. I did not celebrate when the money arrived. And I definitely did not believe in coincidences when she rang the bell. Let me rewind, because stories like this always get twisted by people who were not there. I was married for 7 years, which in relationship years is long enough to know when someone starts rearranging their truths. My wife had this new glow, the kind that does not come from happiness, but from secrecy. She laughed at her phone more than she laughed with me. She talked about finding herself, which is usually code for finding someone else. I stayed calm because panic never fixed anything, and because deep down I wanted to see how far the lie would go. The night she left, she packed fast and light like she had practiced. She said she needed space and clarity and growth. I nodded and helped her carry a bag because dignity weighs less than regret. I did not ask questions because answers given too early are often incomplete. 2 weeks later, a mutual friend accidentally told me about her and another woman posting beach photos together. Arms around each other, smiles too wide to be innocent. I did not confront anyone, I simply saved the images to a folder and named it Reality. Life became quiet after that. Not lonely, just quiet. I cooked simpler meals, slept better, and noticed how much energy I had been spending, trying to hold together something that wanted to fall apart. Then the call came from a lawyer with a voice like paperwork and patience. My uncle was gone, and apparently I was his last living joke. $5 million after taxes sitting calmly waiting for instructions. I thanked the lawyer, hung up, and made myself a sandwich. Because money does not change hunger, I told no one. Not friends, not co-workers, not family. Silence is a powerful filter, and I wanted to see who showed up without knowing what I had become on paper. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message that said, "Hey stranger," like we were characters in a romantic comedy and not two people standing on opposite sides of a broken promise. She said she missed me. She said she made a mistake. She said she wanted to talk. No mention of money, of course, because she was smarter than careless honesty. When she came over, she wore the sweater I once said made her eyes brighter. She talked about nostalgia and destiny and how sometimes people need to get lost to be found. I listened like a man watching a play he had already read the script for. She never mentioned the other woman, never mentioned the photos, never mentioned why now. But she did ask curious questions about my job, my mood, my plans, subtle questions wearing polite disguises. That night after she left, I checked my email and saw a forwarded newsletter sent accidentally from her address. It mentioned inheritance law and sudden wealth management. I laughed quietly because the universe has a sense of humor sharp enough to cut glass. She knew. She just did not know that I knew she knew. And that is where things started to get interesting. I opened the folder called Reality, looked at the photos one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. Then I deleted them all. Not to forgive her, not to forget, but because I no longer needed proof of something that had already taught me its lesson. And in that moment, I realized the money was not the twist in this story. It was just the spotlight. I did not confront her right away, because timing is everything, and I wanted to understand the shape of her return before I judged its intention. People reveal more when they think they are winning. The next few days turned into a quiet experiment where I watched, listened, and learned. She texted every morning with warmth that felt rehearsed, asking if I slept well, if I was eating enough, if I felt lonely. Questions that sound loving until you realize they are inventory checks. When we met for coffee, she chose places that felt nostalgic spots from early marriage days, when hope was still new and promises were easy. She laughed at old jokes, touched my arm a second longer than necessary, and spoke about second chances like they were a spiritual principle, not a convenient opportunity. I played my role calmly, nodding, smiling, offering just enough openness to keep her comfortable, but never enough to give her certainty. Uncertainty makes people careless. She talked about how hard the last 2 months had been, how she felt lost, confused, misunderstood. She never once said the other woman's name, which told me everything I needed to know. Denial is not about forgetting. It is about avoiding consequences, she said. She realized what really mattered, and that money did not buy happiness, which was an interesting thing to say for someone who had just searched inheritance law. I noticed how she watched my reactions closely, how her eyes flickered when I mentioned future plans, even casual ones like repainting the kitchen or taking a short trip alone. She wanted to hear we, not I. She wanted reassurance without offering accountability. I gave her neither. At night, I reflected on the version of myself from months ago, the man who would have begged for honesty, who would have tried to fix things with apologies he did not owe. That man felt distant now. Not broken, just outdated. Growth does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up quietly and rearranges your standards. A week later, she invited herself over for dinner, bringing a bottle of wine and a story about destiny, again. Destiny was working overtime in her vocabulary. She looked around the apartment like she was measuring space, not just physically, but financially. She asked if work was going well. I said better than expected, which was true in more ways than one. She smiled too quickly and said she was proud of me. After dinner, she sat across from me and said she wanted to come home. She said she felt safe with me. She said no one understood her like I did. The words were familiar, but the tone was different. Like a song played at the wrong speed. I asked her a simple question. I asked why now. She paused just long enough to rearrange the truth and said, because love does not follow logic. That answer told me she thought I was still the man who accepted poetry instead of honesty. I leaned back, smiled, and said, I needed time because trust does not sprint. It rebuilds slowly. She agreed quickly, too quickly, grateful for any delay that did not sound like rejection. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly, like she was afraid of losing grip on something valuable. Later that night, another message popped up from her phone, sent by mistake. Again, a link about protecting assets in marriage. Coincidence officially left the building. I did not feel angry, I felt clear. Clarity is a strange relief. It removes the weight of wondering and replaces it with choice. I understood then that this was not about revenge or money or even betrayal anymore. This was about seeing who she was when she thought she was being clever and deciding who I wanted to be in response. I closed my phone, turned off the lights, and slept deeply because for the first time in months, my mind was quiet. The next morning, I woke up with a strange calm, like the kind that comes after a storm when you realize nothing else can fall because everything unstable already has. I made coffee, stood by the window, and thought about how money reveals people the same way silence does. It does not change them, it just removes the mask faster. I decided to let the story continue a little longer, not out of cruelty but curiosity, because I wanted the truth to walk all the way into the room by itself. She started calling more often, leaving gentle messages about small memories, things only couples remember. Burned toast on Sundays, a movie we never finished, a road trip that ended in laughter. She was rebuilding a bridge with sentiment instead of honesty, and I let her place every plank. I responded kindly, never cold, never desperate, a balance that kept her hopeful and off guard. One afternoon, she suggested counseling. She framed it as growth and maturity and healing. I almost admired the strategy because it sounded reasonable to anyone listening from the outside. I agreed because saying yes costs nothing when you already know the destination. At the session, she cried softly, talked about mistakes, talked about fear, talked about loving too much in the wrong direction. She never mentioned betrayal directly. She circled it like a planet afraid of gravity. The counselor asked me how I felt, and I said I felt awake. My wife looked confused by that word because she expected pain or anger, not awareness. I explained calmly that love without honesty is just habit, and habit is not enough to build a future. She nodded along, pretending to understand, while clearly planning her next move. After that session, she became bolder. She talked about merging lives again, about joint plans, about how we could start fresh, stronger, wiser. She joked about how life surprises you sometimes, and glanced at me like she was waiting for a confession. I smiled and said, surprises can be educational. She laughed, unsure if I was joking. That night she stayed over and slept on the couch, which she framed as respect and patience. I respected the performance, but not the intention. While she slept, I checked my phone and saw a notification from a financial forum she had joined, using a shared old account we forgot to delete. The title read, How to Rebuild Trust After Temporary Separation and Sudden Wealth. Temporary separation was an interesting phrase for betrayal. In that moment, something settled inside me completely. Not anger, not sadness, just finality. When you reach the end, emotionally, you stop negotiating with the past. The next morning, I cooked breakfast, thanked her for coming over, and told her I had been thinking a lot. She leaned forward, hopeful eyes bright, like she could already see the ending she wanted. I told her I forgave her. Not because she asked, not because she deserved it, but because forgiveness is a gift you give yourself to stop carrying unnecessary weight. She smiled, visibly relieved, and reached for my hand. Then I gently pulled back and said forgiveness does not mean reunion. Her smile froze like a paused video. She asked what I meant, and I explained slowly, clearly, without accusation. I said I saw the photos. I said I knew about the other woman. I said I knew about the searches and the timing. I said I was not angry, because anger requires attachment, and I had already moved past that. Her face shifted through denial, confusion, and something close to fear. She tried to explain, but explanations given after exposure are usually just damage control. I listened politely because closure does not require agreement. I told her I wished her well and that I would be filing for divorce with fairness and respect. She cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to signal loss. When she left, the apartment felt lighter, like it had exhaled. I sat down, opened my laptop, and closed the chapter formally. Not with bitterness, but with certainty. Money did not save me, wisdom did. And as I looked around my quiet, peaceful home, I realized the real inheritance was knowing my worth and choosing not to trade it for someone who only remembered it when it came with a price. The days after she left were not dramatic. They were deliberate. I changed the locks, not out of fear, but out of symbolism, because some doors close better when they click. The divorce process moved forward quietly, professionally, and without spectacle. She tried a few times to reopen conversations, sending messages that mixed regret with nostalgia and practicality. I responded politely, briefly, and without invitation. Silence can be firm without being cruel. Friends started noticing the shift in me, the steadiness, the humor that had sharpened instead of dulled. One asked if I was seeing someone new, and I laughed because I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in years. I invested time into routines that did not require validation. Morning walks, simple workouts, cooking meals that tasted like effort. Not compromise. Money sat untouched except for practical planning, because wealth without discipline is just chaos wearing a suit. She attempted one last visit, framing it as closure. I agreed to meet in a public place where emotions behave better. She arrived with a careful smile and a speech prepared like notes for an exam she hoped to pass. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said she felt pushed away. She said the other relationship was a mistake born from confusion. I listened like a man hearing a familiar song played off key. When she asked if there was any chance, any opening, any future, I answered honestly and calmly. I said trust once broken does not return as the same shape, and I did not want a version of love that required supervision. She asked about the money, then caught herself too late and tried to reframe it as concern. That slip was small, but loud. I smiled not because it was funny, but because it was final. I told her I hoped she found what she was looking for, and that I was done being the lesson someone learns too late. She nodded, tears forming again, but this time I did not feel responsible for them. Responsibility ends where manipulation begins. Weeks passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. I worked, consulted planners, gave to causes that mattered quietly, anonymously. Generosity feels better when it is not a performance. Occasionally, I would find myself remembering the old marriage not with longing, but with analysis, understanding how slowly I had accepted less than I deserved. Awareness is a patient teacher. It waits until you are ready to listen. One evening, while organizing old files, I came across the empty folder where the photos used to be. The absence felt right. Deleting them was not about erasing pain, it was about refusing to archive disrespect. Some memories are better released than revisited. I realized then that the true twist of this story was not the inheritance or her return, or even the betrayal. It was the moment I stopped asking why and started choosing what. What kind of life, what kind of partner, what kind of man I wanted to be moving forward. Clarity does not shout, it aligns. As I closed my laptop that night, I felt something rare and steady: contentment. Not excitement, not relief, just peace. And I understood that while money had changed my options, it was self-respect that changed my direction. The future no longer felt like a question. It felt like an open road, and for the first time I was not waiting for anyone else to decide where I was allowed to go. After the dust settled, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No chaos, no dramatic fallout, no late-night calls filled with regret. Just space, and space has a way of telling the truth louder than words ever could. I started noticing how different my days felt when they belonged entirely to me. Decisions became lighter mornings, quieter, and even mistakes felt honest because they were mine. People assume healing looks like movement, like travel or reinvention. For me, it looked like stillness. I stayed in the same apartment, the same city, the same routines. But I showed up differently inside them. I was no longer negotiating with a ghost of a marriage that no longer existed. I was present. She tried one last strategy, subtle and almost respectful. She sent a message thanking me for how I handled everything and saying she hoped I found happiness. There was no request, no hook, just a soft door left unlocked. I replied, wishing her well, and closed it gently from my side. Growth does not require dramatic exits, just firm boundaries. With time, I began to see the entire relationship like a long lesson written in invisible ink, only visible once heat was applied. The betrayal did not start when she left it. Started when I ignored my intuition to preserve comfort. That realization was not painful, it was empowering. Accountability without self-punishment is a powerful thing. The money quietly worked in the background, like a tool, not a trophy. I structured it, planned it, protected it. I did not announce it or let it shape my identity. Wealth attracts noise, and I had learned to value quiet. The irony was not lost on me that the same silence that hid her intentions now protected my peace. One evening, a mutual friend mentioned seeing her again with the same woman. They looked serious, happy even. I felt nothing but a distant gratitude that I was no longer part of a triangle that required me to pretend. Everyone deserves a life that fits them, and sometimes that life just does not include you. I reflected often on the moment I deleted those photos. Not because of what they showed, but because of what they represented. Proof is heavy when you carry it for validation. Once you trust yourself, you do not need evidence to justify leaving. That was the moment I truly chose myself. Slowly, opportunities appeared, not just financial, but personal. Conversations deepened, friendships strengthened, and laughter returned without effort. I was not chasing happiness. I was creating conditions where it could visit naturally, and it did, often quietly, without announcement. Looking back, I realized the suspense of my life had never been about whether she would come back. It was about whether I would abandon myself again if she did. And when that question was answered, everything else fell into place. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges without erasing the lesson. Months passed, and my life no longer felt like a recovery. It felt like a direction. People often ask when you know you are truly over something, and the answer is simple. When it stops narrating your decisions. I stopped comparing moments to the past and started measuring them by how honest they felt. I learned to recognize peace not as boredom, but as stability, the kind that lets you think clearly and laugh easily. I filled my schedule with intention, not distraction. I took classes I had postponed for years, read books I once pretended to finish, and reconnected with parts of myself that had gone quiet during the marriage. Not lost, just waiting. Occasionally, I would hear updates about her life indirectly. Nothing dramatic, just fragments. She had moved, she had changed jobs. She was still explaining herself to people who no longer asked. I did not feel superior or bitter, just distant. Distance is not punishment, it is alignment. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork, I realized something subtle but important. My decisions were no longer reactions. Every choice I made came from preference, not defense. That was the real transformation. When you stop living in response to someone else, you reclaim authorship of your life. I started mentoring younger colleagues, sharing lessons without preaching. I never spoke badly about my marriage or my ex because bitterness teaches nothing. Instead, I spoke about boundaries, clarity, and listening to discomfort before it becomes regret. Wisdom lands better when it is calm. There was a moment standing in line at a grocery store when I caught my reflection in the glass and smiled without thinking. It surprised me because it was effortless, not forced, not performative, just present. That was when I knew the story had changed genres. It was no longer a drama, it was a grounded narrative with depth and humor. Money continued to sit quietly, supporting instead of leading. I funded ideas, not egos, helped people without becoming their solution, and protected my future without obsession. I understood then that wealth does not free you from problems, it just reveals how you handle responsibility. I never posted about my journey, never explained myself publicly. Closure does not require witnesses. The most meaningful victories happen privately, when no one is clapping and you still choose integrity. I realized that the suspense people crave in stories like mine is not about betrayal or inheritance. It is about the moment someone realizes they do not need to be chosen again because they already chose themselves. That is the part nobody forgets once they live it. As the year turned, I felt ready not for a new relationship, but for a new standard. One built on mutual clarity, not convenience. Honesty, not timing. I was not waiting, I was available to the right energy. And that difference changed everything. The final realization arrived quietly, the way real truths usually do not announced, not dramatic, just undeniable. I understood that the story I had lived was never about loss. It was about alignment. Losing someone who only returned when circumstances improved is not a tragedy. It is a clarification. I thought back to that first knock on the door, the smile, the timing, the careful innocence. If this had happened years earlier, I might have mistaken it for fate. Now I saw it for what it was, opportunity wearing nostalgia, and there is no anger in that observation. Just maturity. I did not become colder after everything. I became clearer. Clarity does not harden you, it filters. It lets the right things in and keeps the wrong ones from feeling personal. I stopped explaining my boundaries because the right people do not require footnotes. One evening, while walking through the city, lights soft and unhurried, I felt something settle fully into place. Gratitude not for the money, not even for the lesson, but for the version of myself that did not collapse when tested. Strength is quiet. It does not announce itself. It just stands firm when it matters. I understood then why deleting those photos mattered so much. Not because they hurt, but because keeping them would have meant I was still negotiating with a past that had already ended. Closure is not a conversation, it is a decision. And I had made mine. If she ever tells this story, she will probably say she came back because she realized my value, and that might be true in her own way. But the part she will never fully understand is that I did not reject her because I gained $5 million. I declined the reunion because I gained perspective. The suspense in my life resolved not with confrontation or revenge, but with self-respect. I did not need to prove anything to anyone, not even her. Walking away clean is a skill, and I learned it well. Today my life is steady, not loud, fulfilled, not flashy. I trust myself now, and that trust shapes every decision I make. Love included, especially love. So if there is a lesson here, it is simple and unromantic, but powerful. When someone leaves to find themselves and returns only after finding your value, believe the timing, not the apology, and choose yourself without bitterness, without drama, and without looking back. That is how the story ends. Not with a door slamming, but with one closing gently while another opens wide. And for the first time, I step forward, not as someone who survived betrayal, but as someone who outgrew it.